Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe Margaret, you can give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, since you're the only one that I can see. Excellent, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Abra, and I am a faculty fellow in the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society here at the University of Southern Mississippi. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this year's Richard McCarthy Lecture. We are thrilled to offer a discussion with Professor Margaret MacMillan about her latest book, visual aids here, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. And the program is going to be Q&A style, initially between Professor MacMillan and myself, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you want to, while we're talking, or already if you have things that you know you want to ask her, you can add questions via the Q&A function. Please use that one for questions that you may want to ask. The chat is also open for more general comments or whatever you want to do, but it will be the Q&A feed that we pull the questions from. And before introducing Professor MacMillan, I just want to take a minute to thank the supporters who have made today's event possible. The Richard McCarthy Lecture Series was founded in 2006 through the generous support of Dr. Richard McCarthy and Dr. Craig Howard, and is designed to bring together students, faculty, and community members here in Southern Mississippi to access cutting-edge research in the field of war and society. And of course, this year, through the wonders of Zoom, we hope to be reaching even more people all across the country and the world. Professor MacMillan is in Oxford. I know there are a few folks tuning in from Canada, where both she and I were born. And so over the years, the McCarthy Lecture Series has enabled us to offer a range of programming, from a panel discussion led by veterans of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, to lectures by leading historians like Professor MacMillan. And so if you're interested in checking out any of our previous events, many of them are available on our YouTube channel. And you can also learn more about the McCarthy Lecture Series and the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society on our website, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And all of those links, in order to show you where to access those, are being shared in the chat, so you can grab those. And now I want to introduce our guest. Margaret MacMillan is Professor of History at the University of Toronto and an Emeritus Professor of International History at Oxford University. She was also Warden of St. Antony's College, Oxford, from 2007 to 2017. Her research specializes in British imperial history and the international history of the 19th and 20th centuries. Her previous publications include the best-selling and critically acclaimed Paris 1919, Nixon and Mao, and The War That Ended Peace. She gave the CBC's Massey Lectures in 2015 and the BBC's Reith Lectures in 2018. She is Honorary Fellow of the British Academy, a Companion of the Order of Canada, and a Companion of Honor in the UK. And of course, her most recent book is War, our focus today. And we are so pleased to be able to welcome her virtually to the Dale Center. So let's get to it. Switch my papers here. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you, Professor MacMillan, is that this is a very ambitious book. It offers a global history of why war happens, the experiences of warriors and civilians, the efforts to control or prevent war, war's cultural representation, to name only a few of the topics that you tackle, from before recorded history through to the present day. So basically, I wanted to ask, what drove your decision to write such a big general history of war like this?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for that nice introduction. And it's a pleasure to be even virtually at the Dale Center and be part of the McCarthy Lecture Series. I just wish I could be in Mississippi, but there we are. I mean, Zoom is wonderful, but COVID is not. So here I am in Oxford. Why did I write this book? I think it's a combination of things. Partly because I've always been interested in war. I'm a historian mostly of the 19th and 20th centuries, and there's an awful lot of war in those centuries, and there's an awful lot of war in most centuries in most parts of the world. And it's something that's always interested me, and it's come in and out of what I've taught and what I've researched. And then I was given a chance. I suppose it's the second reason, when the BBC asked me to give a series of 5 lectures, and they said you can lecture on anything you want, which is terrifying, because suddenly my mind, I had trouble deciding. And then I kept thinking, why not war? It's something I've always been interested in. It will make me do some more reading, think about it. And I think the final reason possibly I did it was because after I'd done all the work, of course, for the lectures, it seemed a shame not to write a book. But the final reason perhaps was I think as historians, we write for each other, of course, but I think we should also write for the public. And I think we should be prepared to try and communicate what we're doing to anyone who's interested in the public. And war is a very important subject. And it is something that has affected our societies, affected our history, affected our cultural and political and other values and institutions. And I thought, you know, if I can help write a book that will get people interested in this subject, maybe want to read a bit more, make them understand the different questions and debates around how we even look and think about war, then that would be a good thing to do. So combination of reasons, I think. And there were times when I thought, what have I got myself into, of course.
Well, and I think it very much succeeds on that level. Haley, our graduate assistant, and I were talking about this before we logged on with you, that one of the great things about this is that it is accessible to a general audience, but also it's clear that you're engaging with some historiographical debates and other questions that academic historians are often concerned with. Hopefully we can dig into that a little bit. But I wanted to ask you, since we're on the kind of process question, and you mentioned those moments of what have I done? I mean, can you speak a little bit about your research and writing process? How you decided what to include, what sources you consulted, and sort of how you all reined it all in the writing process?
Well, it helped that I was doing the lectures first, because I could only do 5 lectures. And I made a list of all the subjects I wanted to cover, which came to about 25. And so I had to try and break it down and think, what are the most important things that I think people may want to know about, that I want to talk about? And that helped to shape it. And I thought one of the things I'm interested in is, why do we fight? Why do some people become warriors and others don't? What about the gender issue? What about science and technology? Why do wars start? So I sort of boiled it down a bit. And I'd already done quite a bit of reading, and I started to do more. And giving the lectures in themselves was a useful thing, because the audience asked very good questions. And there were things that I hadn't really talked about very much. I mean, I hadn't talked that much about women and why women haven't been, for most of history, the sorts of people who go off and fight. And so that got me thinking. And so then I did more research. I can't say I have a very clear process. I start to write, and then I think, oh, I don't know anything about that. So I go and look up that and try and find out more. And I tried, talking to people. I was very lucky. I had a lot of colleagues I could talk to about it. So it's a trial and error process. And when you finish a book, as you know, you look back and think, I would have done it differently now. But you do your best.
Thank you. That's great. And do you think that, or how do you think that your previous work on the British Empire or post-war foreign policy or the Paris Peace Conference informed or inspired this book?
Well, my work on the British Empire made me realize just how important organization to fight war. And if you have an organized armed force, you're more likely to be able to impose your will and your presence and your rule on others, and how important technology was. I mean, the 19th century saw this incredible expansion of the European empires, because for very, very brief period, Europe had an edge in technology. It had this, it developed steamships first, so did North America, but it also developed railways, it developed new kinds of guns, it developed kinds of medicines, which meant that Europeans could travel to parts of the world where disease might have once made it very difficult for them to stay if they survived at all. And so I was interested in that, in the colonial wars and what that meant. And then if you do the history of the 20th century, which I became more and more interested in, then again, the 2 great world wars really shape so much of that century. And I looked at the endings of wars. I mean, I've spent a lot of time on the First World War. I've done the beginning and the end, but perhaps not that much in between. But I became interested in why wars break out and why then they're so difficult to stop. And so being interested in war is something that sort of grew with my interest in other sorts of history.
Thank you. And in your comments there, you're sort of leading into what was going to be my next really big question. In terms of the violence associated with colonialism, or in terms of why wars kind of break out, what did you ultimately conclude in terms of what it is to define a war? You draw interesting parallels of whether gang violence can be called a war, or like I said, the violence of colonialism, is that inherently warlike, or is there something specific that has to define what a war is, and what did you ultimately conclude about that?
Well, it's a matter partly of choice because, we use the language of war very widely. We talk about wars on drugs, wars on illness, wars on COVID, wars on this and that. And I think in a way that sort of dilutes the meaning of war, because I think it is, I would argue anyway, it's a very specific kind of human activity. An anthropologist I know once said to me, war is the most organized of all human activities. But he was referring, and I think this is what I understand war to be, to the organized application of violence. Violence is part of war, but war in itself is a highly organized activity by a group who have some political coherence. And so a bunch of marauders who just come together, or a mob at a football game or a hockey game, that isn't war. They may use violence, but it's not purposive, it's not organized, it doesn't have a goal. And so for me, and we can disagree about this a lot, war involves the application of violence for a particular aim by a group that has a particular identity. And there are obviously going to be gray areas. I mean, a number of gangs, particularly as they grow larger, urban gangs, for example, take on the characteristics of groups with political agendas, the sorts of gangs that will control, say, the centers of cities like Rio de Janeiro, often have political purposes, or the sort of gangs that grew out perhaps of the drug trade in Mexico began to take on political goals and political purposes. So sometimes, there is a blurring of a line between groups organized around crime and using violence and those with political goals. And you'll see it in civil wars. You get groups who make money off the drug trade or selling blood diamonds or whatever, but they exhibit the characteristics of gangs, but they also have a more political purpose. Everyone, we argue about the meaning of war, but I think it's quite useful to be fairly narrow in your definition, because otherwise the term war just seems to me to lose much meaning if we apply it to everything.
Well, and makes it harder to study in a way, right? And in terms of to hone in on what you specifically want to understand about something. And you alluded to this in your comments. So why does it happen then? If it's about aims, if it's often about politics, what do you see as being sort of the most common causes of wars?
Well, I think there are all sorts of causes, and down through history there have been, ridiculous things. I mean, I still think of the British one, the War of Jenkins' Ear, where the Spanish apparently cut off the ear of a British sea captain, and he carried it around, this horrible little sort of withered ear, complaining to everyone. And the British government, the English government actually at the time, did nothing about it until they wanted a reason to go to fight with Spain. The real reason, or the underlying reasons, I think, for them, it may often be an excuse. Someone's rude to someone slaps someone says something unpleasant about someone else. But I think if you look behind that, the reasons for, I would say, boil down to about three different things. Very roughly, greed. I want something that you've got, and we're going to take it. We've got force. We think we're stronger and tougher than you. We want that piece of land. We want that castle. We want that trade. We want that loot, whatever it is. Or we want to take slaves from your people and take them home and make them our slaves. So I would say, there's greed. And then the converse of that, which is the second main reason, is fear. You fight because you've got something to defend. You want to defend what it is you have. You want to defend your family. You want to defend your home, whatever. You fight because you feel perhaps that you have absolutely no alternative if you are not to be totally destroyed or made into a slave and lose everything you hold dear. And the third reason, and these all sort of overlap, I think, is ideology, ideas. We fight, I think, and we have fought through history for different sorts of ideas. And some of these can be religious. We fight, or people have fought to make a better place in the earth, or as they see it. We fight for a particular God, a particular religion, because we believe that we are right to do so. And those who are standing in our way are in some ways evil. We fight for a cause. We fight for nationalism. We fight because we feel there is something that we are prepared to kill others for if necessary, and to die ourselves. And so these can often overlap. I mean, you'll get people who want to get something out of a war, but will also have a cause. You think of crusaders. I mean, they went off to the Middle East. They said to take back the holy places of Christianity from the Muslims, but they also helped themselves to an awful lot of stuff as they did so. So these three categories are very rough. But I think most wars you can fit into one or the other, even though sometimes they may be overlapping causes.
Right. Well, so speaking of nationalism, that was actually what I was going to ask next, is that it seems throughout the book you identify a number of broad patterns that could apply to wars really across time and place, like I said, since before recorded history. But you also do seem to be drawing a pretty clear distinction between pre-modern wars and modern wars, that modern war or total war was something kind of new in certain respects. And so can you say a little bit more about that? What makes a war modern for you?
Well, it's a tricky one because I've been thinking about it. I'm not sure I'm entirely right. I mean, some pre-modern wars, like the Mongol invasions, which sort of put everyone in a particular town or city to the sword, I would say in a way are total wars. But I think what makes modern war is this two or three different things coming together. One is modern technology and modern production, modern economy. I mean, by the 19th century, guns, for example, that had been made by hand by craftsmen were now being turned out on assembly lines. And that meant, in effect, you could turn out a lot more guns and you could repair them a lot easily because if one piece broke, you just got another standardized piece and slotted it in. So suddenly it became possible to produce the things you needed to fight a war, from boots to guns, on a very large scale indeed, and to keep on producing them. It also became possible, thanks to technology, to move bigger and bigger armed forces around, with the steam engine, with railways, with steamships, and then of course with the internal combustion engine, and then later on airplanes. It became possible to move armies of a size that wouldn't have been possible in the days when they had to carry their own food with them or simply find it as they went. I mean, so often armies before the 19th century starved to death. I mean, probably more of Napoleon's soldiers in the big army he took into Russia froze and starved to death. They never got killed in battle. And so it became possible to have wars on a very big scale. At the same time, it became possible to have the motivation for people to want to fight in those wars. And I would put that down very largely to nationalism, this sense that is actually quite new in human history, that we belong to something called a nation. If you'd ask people, most people in the world in the 18th century, who do you belong to? They'd say, well, I belong to this village or this religion, or I'm the servant of that particular lord in his castle up the hill. But you probably wouldn't say, I'm a Pole, or I'm a French person, or I'm British. I mean, it's beginning to happen, but the 19th century really brings in this idea that you identify with this very big group, a group you'll never meet because it's made up often of hundreds of thousands and millions of people, but it's something that people begin to feel passionately attached to. It's an idea, it's a concept. And so people are willing to put themselves out there, fight and die for the idea of a nation. And they're willing to, again, as ideologies will do, they're willing to kill other people. And so it's the combination of the technology and the means of production, plus the ideas. And what is also happening, and I think this is why someone had to come up with the phrase total war. In the First World War, someone actually said we have to describe it in a different way because it is different from what we've seen before. And more of society is involved. It's no longer the case that your armed forces, your Navy sails off and fight somewhere else, or your army marches off and you don't really hear from them again until they come home because they're in another part of the world or a different country or a different part of the country. With the modern war and the demands of modern war, more and more people have to get involved. And so you need people to work in the factories, which is why more and more women begin to take part in jobs outside the home. Or you need your artists, you need your scientists, you need the money. And so the modern type of war, certainly as we saw it in the 20th century and the 19th century, draws in more and more of the resources of society. And the other side of that is if you're fighting that sort of war, it becomes okay to try and kill and disrupt the lives of civilians on the other side, because they're no longer seen, as so often they were, as somehow distinct from those fighting. They're part of the whole structure that sustains those who are fighting. And so to drop bombs on civilians, killing women and children and old people, is now part of war. And so war, I think, because of these factors coming together, becomes really something that sucks in and then, of course, destroys large parts of societies.
Absolutely. And, on that front of technology and social change and, the other effects or perhaps unintended effects of war that sometimes happen. You have a great sentence that I really liked in the first chapter, that it is another uncomfortable truth about war that it brings both destruction and creation. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, about the ways that war advances science or technology or society or all of those different things.
Well, I think great crises which force societies to pull themselves together or go under can bring extraordinary results. I mean, we wouldn't choose to do it this way. But sometimes when we face a great crisis, we find ourselves doing things that we would have thought were unthinkable. And I often have been thinking, as we all have, I'm sure, about the past year, because it's about the anniversary when the lockdown started for COVID. And if you had said to people a year ago, last February, we are going to see governments getting highly involved in producing vaccines, we're going to see an incredible coordination between government and the drug companies to produce vaccines in under a year. You know, normally the production of a vaccine will take up to 10 years before it's finally approved and all the testing is done. And if you'd said to people over a year ago, we're going to see government spending huge amounts of money to prop up the economy and to help out those at the bottom levels of society, we all would have said, no, that's impossible. It's not going to happen. I mean, no government's going to do that. And so sometimes what a great crisis will do is push societies and governments into doing things and thinking, and doing things they thought were inconceivable and thinking in different ways. And wars, and I think it is an uncomfortable paradox. And quite often I encounter people who get quite annoyed with me for saying this, but war can produce beneficial effects. I mean, we don't want to think of war doing that, and we would, of course, wouldn't do it in that way. But war can speed up enormously developments in science and technology. For example, production of drugs, which have saved hundreds of thousands, millions of lives, was speeded up in both the First and Second World Wars by the need to try and protect those who were actually fighting. Great advances in surgery were made, sadly, because there were so many people who needed things done. Plastic surgery, for example, took huge strides forward in the First World War because of the horrific injuries that people were suffering as a result of gas attacks. And wars will also speed up social changes, which were probably coming anyway, but we never know. And changes in the position of women. You know, women participated in supporting both the First and Second World Wars in Britain, in the United States, in Canada. You know, you've all seen, I'm sure we've all seen the poster of Rosie the Riveter. You know, women were expected to do the sort of jobs which it had been assumed they couldn't do. And because of that, it became less possible for society to say women can't participate in society. They're too weak. They don't understand it. They can't do these tricky jobs. They can't fly airplanes. They, you know, how could a woman fly an airplane, you know, fly a bomber? Well, they did because they were needed. And I think one of the reasons women got the votes a bit quicker than they might have done was because of the wars. And because governments recognized they really could no longer make the argument that women wouldn't know what to do with the vote. Women had shown they were capable of participating in societies. And I think the two world wars also brought greater social equality in many societies because the gap between the rich and the poor was compressed. The rich had to pay more taxes, the poor were paid better. And so we saw greater social equality in a number of countries around the world after the First and Second World Wars, from Japan to the United States. Greater social equality, partly or very largely a result of what had happened in the war. And often those effects were going to go on into peacetime. I mean, I could go on, I'll stop there, but I do think war can make us and make governments do things that they wouldn't think are possible normally.
Well, and more quickly, right? I was thinking when you were talking about the social change piece too, that one of my favorite books to teach is one that you quote in here as well, which is Vera Britton's Testament of Youth. And one of the things that I always say to my students thinking about the breakdown of convention is how, you know, when she's first courting Roland before the war breaks out, there are these incredible rules. Good middle class girl, you know, has to have a chaperone and all these things. And then suddenly he's off to war and she's allowed to go meet him, you know, in a different city without anyone with her. And just, it was war. So this had to happen.
Yeah. And, you know, and even things like changes in fashion, you know, women began to wear trousers during the First World War, because if they were doing jobs in factories or driving tractors or whatever, I mean, wearing lots of skirts wasn't practical. And so they started to wear trousers, and quite often they started to cut their hair, because having long hair can be really dangerous in a factory. I mean, you have to put it up or you can really run the risk of suffering a very serious accident. And so, yes, I think changes come about as a result of wars often. I mean, other things bring change too, but I think wars will, as you say, often speed change up.
Absolutely. And I did want to talk to you a little bit more about women. You've already said a fair amount about, you know, the changes to their status that war can potentially speed up or hasten, be it, you know, personal independence or political independence. But women come up in the book in all kinds of other ways too, that I found really interesting as kind of the impetus to war, or as symbols of war, or national symbols, as pacifists, but also proponents of war, as of course civilian victims of war. And so can you say a little bit more about all those different ways that you see women sort of embodying or representing war's effects?
I think women are affected by wars in a number of ways. They're affected often because changes take place, and changes will take place in their lives, and often those who they had relied on to look after them, their husbands, their fathers, their sons, go off to war, and so they're forced to become more self-reliant. And sometimes they actually find that something they welcome. And there's a very interesting book I read about British women in the Second World War, and a number of them said, it was amazing. I got out of the home and I earned my own money for the first time, and I became independent. And I'd never done that before. I'd never had my own money. I'd never had a job. I never sort of had a group of friends I could go off to the pub with. It changed, it was a real change for me. And so women, I think, can benefit in those ways from war. But of course, they're also the targets of war. There's a long and very dishonorable and hideous tradition in war of taking women as prizes in war. If you defeat your enemy, you take the women. I mean, you see on Trajan's column in Rome, the triumphal column in Rome of Trajan's victories, you will see the women captives being led to become part of the household of some free Roman. Rape is often used as deliberately in war, or it's seen as a reward for the soldiers, often a combination of the two. And you then get, there are arguments that women are naturally more peaceable than men. It's true that a lot of women have played very important parts in peace movements, and we know that, and women have played very important parts in things like the anti-landmine campaign. And so it is true that women have contributed a lot to attempts to limit and end war. But we have to remember, because human nature is complicated, women have also been cheerleaders. Women have encouraged men to go off and fight. Women have brought up their sons to feel that fighting is the best thing they can do. Women have tried to shame men who have not fought. In the First World War, women, certainly in Canada and Britain, I don't know about the United States, but I suspect it may have happened there as well, women would give white feathers to men who were of military age but not wearing uniform, to suggest, of course, that they were cowards and they should immediately go off and join up. And so women are affected by, but also affect war in a number of ways, from being its victims to being its cheerleaders.
Absolutely. Well, and so of course, something like the White Feather Campaign would also point to the ways that service in a military or fighting in a war becomes so tied at very many moments in time to masculinity as well, right? To sort of our ideas about what it means to be a man. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about that, but also about the transition that you see happening there, because one of the things I found really interesting in the book was when you talked about pre-modern militaries in particular, and how soldiers were not as well regarded as they later would be in the modern period, or I would say even still to the present day, that you have that scene from Henry V with Falstaff's kind of cronies or soldiers that are kind of the dregs of society, right? And so I wonder if you could say something about the changing view of soldiers and warriors across time, and how that's kind of linked to masculinity.
Yeah, well, I think there are two sort of things here which are linked, and I think is very important. Different societies place different values on those who fight and on the military. Traditional Chinese society, although they certainly had great generals, the various dynasties in China had terrific generals, and many of whom helped to expand the land controlled by the dynasty. But those who were most valued in classical Chinese society were the scholars. And those went through a very rigorous examination system. If you got through it, you worked for the government, you were seen as the highest epitome of Chinese civilization. So we have different types of values placed on different sorts of people in different societies. And I think culture is very, very important in this. And societies will change over time. Sweden, which used to be certainly among its upper classes, and even I think those who were in the lower classes, had a heavily militarized society in which people admired those who fought. And Sweden, of course, is a very different country today. So culture is important, but we have to remember it also changes. But the pressure on men to fight, and sometimes I think It is hard to be a man in certain societies because you are expected to be brave. You're expected to want to go off and fight. You're expected to be prepared to get yourself killed and kill others. And of course, a lot of men don't want to do that. And even in heavily militarized societies, there are those who would rather do something else, do something peaceful, become a monk, read a book, not go off to war, which is one of the reasons I think that military training is so important, because that's the purpose of training, is to turn people in to those who will do the sorts of things that they might not want to do. So I don't buy the theory that men are inherently violent and women are inherently peaceful. I think it's biological reductionism, but I do think that men in many societies are brought up to see being prepared to be a warrior and being prepared to fight as something that they should want to do. Now, it depends very much. A lot of this is class-based. In Sparta, only those who were free were expected to want to fight. Those who were the slaves, the helots, were not expected to want to fight, and in fact, it was disapproved of. And there's a famous occasion in Sparta where the Spartan rulers were a bit worried about, whether the helots were getting a little bit too independent. And they said, how many of you will volunteer to fight for Sparta? And all those who stepped forward as volunteers, they killed, because they didn't want that sort of spirit among those who were slaves. It was only among those who were free that they wanted. And so you do get, I think, real class distinctions. And certainly in the armies you talked about in Europe before the modern age, the officers came from the class that it was considered noble and manly to go and fight. The ordinary soldiers and ordinary sailors came from the parts of society which people thought were expendable. If you had a good, honest farmer who was working very hard, or a good shoemaker, you didn't want to waste them in a war, because basically the sorts of wars that were fought up until the present age, you wanted cannon fodder. You wanted people who obey their officers, get into the field and do what they were told. And so, you were often in 18th century England, for example, if you committed a crime, you could be given a choice between being hanged or joining the army. And, that gives you an indication of just what military service was seen like for the ordinary soldiers. Now, the whole question of whether men are naturally inclined to fight, I'm not sure. I think the fact that we have to have so much military training suggests that men also have reservations about wanting to fight. And women have not fought as much. I mean, very few women have fought, but there have been examples of women fighting in the past. There are a couple of famous women who fought in the American Civil War, for example, often disguising themselves as men. And there probably really were Amazon warriors. There's now archaeological evidence of women warriors being buried with the skeleton showing the marks of trauma with what are obviously weapons around them. And what seems to be happening today is, as more and more women come into the armed forces, and as more and more in certain countries are assigned to combat roles, because it used to be when women first joined the armed forces, they did the sort of support things, they did the clerical things, they did the office jobs, but increasingly women are fighter pilots, they're snipers, they take part in it. Certainly in guerrilla wars, women have always fought and always provided support. And so I suspect it's really historical and cultural reasons that not so many women have fought. And, I think, well, I mean, biologists will probably disagree with me, but I don't think men are naturally fighters and women are naturally not fighters. I think so much of it has to do with culture. And as culture changes, the roles of the different sexes change.
No, I agree with you. And I think that we're at an interesting moment for that, in contemporary society, with these debates in this country in particular about women in combat and whether they should be drafted if ever the draft became an issue again. On the experience of fighting, though, and the kind of face of battle aspects of the book, you open chapter 5 with descriptions of the Battle of Towton during the Wars of the Roses and in England, and then the Battle of Antietam at the American Civil War. And I found this to be a really evocative juxtaposition. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, what you were trying to do by comparing those two battles as a way into a chapter dedicated to why people fight or how they fight.
I think what I was trying to do is look for continuities over time and place, that there are many different styles of warfare and the weapons change, the ways people fight change, the sorts of people who fight change. But the experience of combat itself, I suspect, doesn't change all that much. I mean, you are out there, you are risking your life, and you're going to kill or get killed. I mean, that's always the possibility there. And you are also probably, and I think this is probably fairly constant through time, dependent on those you're fighting with. You depend on those you're with. You know, the Greeks and the Romans both had this saying that you carry your shield for the man beside you, because they would overlap their shields. And it was very important that you could rely on the person beside you, and that person knew that he had to rely on you. And so I think I was trying to get at that although the weapons change, the uniforms change, a lot changes, there is still something about the experience of combat. And there's still something that's very difficult to understand about it. And, you know, so many great writers have tried to deal with it and tried to explain it. And they all end up, or they tend to say that we will do our best, but there's something inexplicable. You know, Tim O'Brien, who I think is one of the great writers of the 20th century, and his books on the Vietnam War, I find extraordinary. But in the things they carried, which is this extraordinary evocation of what it was like to be a soldier in the Vietnam War, he says, you know, he says almost the closer you get to explaining, the more elusive it gets. I'm not quoting him properly, but when you try to explain it, you're still not getting it. And yet we do try and explain it, and we try and understand it, and people try and write about it. And a number of things, it seems to me, come out about being in combat, that often time will seem to freeze, that what may take only a few seconds will seem to last for an eternity. And the intensity of the experience, that suddenly everything seems almost electric. And this comes out again and again in the memoirs, that you're in this extraordinary moment. Now, not all wars are like that. In wars, there are long periods of just hanging around and waiting and slogging it out, or not even fighting at all. But it's the moments of combat that I was so interested in. And I found some wonderful quotations from a book by a great Belarusian writer, Svetlana Alexievich, who wrote about the experience of women, Russian women, Soviet women in the Second World War. And a number of them said this as well. One of them said, you know, everything seems so beautiful. The sky is beautiful. The clouds are beautiful. You know, it's this extraordinary heightened sentiment, plus fear, plus terror. And so that's what I was trying to get at, that probably doesn't change that much, even while other things change.
Absolutely, thank you. That it's what you're describing in some ways, this kind of question of whether there's a universal experience of soldiering is something that we've been talking a lot about in the graduate seminar that I'm teaching this semester. I think I mentioned to you before we started that my students are here, they've all read your book. And so I did want to ask if there were any particular historical debates that you wanted to address in the book. I know you talk about the military revolution, about sort of the motivation of soldiers, and these are all conversations that that we've been having this semester in the course. And so, you know, what particular interventions did you want to make into military history as a scholarly field?
Gender, I think, was one that I became more and more interested in. And it seems to me, but you can correct me, that there's still been relatively little written about it. You know, it's not a subject that's been explored, perhaps as much as it could have been. And I'd love to see more on that. And what is it that creates these particular attitudes, and why is it? And is there a biological element? I mean, you know, I just find all this exploration so interesting. At the other extreme, I suppose, from the why do people fight in different ways, is why do governments think they can use war as an instrument? You know, why do they think that war is something they can use, and how do they think they can use it? And why do they sometimes so carelessly go into war? You know, the terrifying thing about war is how easily it gets out of control. You know, and whenever a government says we're going to have a neat little war, we're going to do a police action here, you think, uh-oh, you know, this is probably going to end badly.
Yeah, I mean, two things. I had written down the Clemenceau quote that you included, making peace is harder than waging war, you know, sort of as sometimes you just kind of fall into these things because it's easier than not falling into it. And I want to ask you a little bit about that, but I wanted to say on the gender front that, you know, we're trying to do something about that at the Dale Center. We actually have a lot of faculty and students working on gender and war, and a special endowment for research in those areas. We are very lucky to have had sponsored. So it's coming, but yeah, I wanted to ask you whether writing this book about war changed your view of peace, or what peace is, given that you spent a long time thinking about probably one of the most famous peace conferences in history. You know, how how do you now view what peace is compared to war, or how you get to it, or why it breaks down ultimately?
Yeah. Well, I think, war and peace are intimately involved, and I don't think peace is an absence of war and war is an absence of peace. I think, they're connected. And I think we need perhaps to understand that we need to put something of the same effort into peace that we put into war. That we assume peace just happens, whereas war is something that you need to organize for. And I think we need to think very seriously both about how we control war. I mean, one of the things I came to understand better when I was doing my book is just how many attempts there have been made to control war, which sounds curious, that you'd even try and control this thing that so easily runs out of control. But we keep doing it. And I think we're trying to do something. We're trying to recognize its existence. And that's not to condone it, but simply to recognize that it exists. And we're trying to do something about it. If we can limit the damage done by war, if we can limit the sorts of weapons, and we keep trying, and it doesn't always work, but we keep trying, if we can limit the legitimacy of certain targets so that those who are innocent bystanders don't get willy-nilly killed, if we can try and look for the causes of wars and try and eliminate them before they start, or if we can try and find ways of forcing those who would fight to sit down at the table. We look at the failures, but sometimes we do succeed. It doesn't always work, but there was finally a peace agreement in Northern Ireland, which did stop that awful long period of the Troubles. The government of Colombia did manage to get a peace agreement between the rebels, the FARC and others, for example, and the government, which did bring a sort of peace to that country. It may not last, but I think it is possible to bring conflicts to an end. And then, of course, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we bring them to an end so that they're not going to start up again? How do we overcome the hatreds? I mean, you've had a civil war in the United States. And one of the great issues with the Civil War, all wars, but I think with the Civil War, because it's so passionately felt, is how do you end it so that you can begin to rebuild a country? And it's a big question for countries that are dealing with internal conflict, but it can be done. And I think countries can move on. And countries that were once deeply divided or once very warlike have become very different. I mean, the encouraging place I see, and there are a number of encouraging places, but one very encouraging place I think is Western Europe, which was responsible for two hideous world wars in the 20th century. And I think now it's very difficult to imagine that any two European countries would go to war with each other as they did in the 20th century.
The fact that you can walk from France to Germany, just like stroll across the Rhine. We have a study abroad program in Strasbourg, but we always make that point, like, this is pretty amazing.
Yeah, indeed.
So I just have a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. But, you speak in the conclusion to the book about the future of war. And when you were talking about peace, it got me thinking about that if the nature of war is changing, and particularly terrorist action and so forth being such a part of it, are we going to be in this constant state of war or not, right? Like, is peace even possible in that sort of environment, given how much war has changed? But related to that, can you say a little more about how you see the future of war operating?
I think, again, I mean, with terrorism, I think it will probably be present with us for some time to come. I mean, it's the wrong word, but these things seem to come in waves. And there was a lot of nihilistic terrorist activity in the world at the end of the 19th century. Anarchists setting off bombs, randomly killing people in North America, but also, of course, in Europe. I mean, I forget how many provincial governors were assassinated in Russia before the First World War, but it was something like 50 or 60. I mean, it was just something that happened. And then it seems to have spent itself. And we had less of it for a while, and now it seems to be back with us. People who radicalize themselves, small groups who see terror. It sounds ridiculous, but it is a weapon of the weak. They can't destroy the societies they're attacking, but they can cause damage, and they can create horrific incidents. And they will keep doing it for whatever reasons. Some of them, I think, want to become martyrs. I'm not sure we framed it in the right way. We talk about a war on terror, which I think gives more status to these groups and to these people than they deserve. They're not warriors, they are murderers. And I think it should be treated as a police action. And I don't even like the formulation of a war on terror. I mean, you know, as others have said, you're waging war on a noun. How do you know when that war is ended? Who is the enemy? And how do you know when you finished with it? So I have sort of problems with that. But what I do think, as far as the future of war, and this is, you know, I hope is going to be wrong, I think we're going to see a lot of wars that are pretty much low level, often fought with very old weapons. I was just listening to a radio broadcast about the killings in Rwanda, and a lot of those were done with hoes and machetes. They were not done with advanced weaponry. And we're seeing wars today that are dragging on in Afghanistan, the war between Ethiopia, or the Ethiopian government, in the province of Tigray, and now this conflict in Mozambique, where the oil facility has been attacked. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of those because we're going to have the sorts of groups and causes that make them likely, and we're going to see we're already seeing failed states where powerful groups can then simply fight it out. So at that level, we're going to see war. We have already seen it around the world. The other type of war is going to be the war that very few countries can afford, but it's going to be the very high-tech war. It's going to be cyber war. It's going to be war in space. Space is already becoming militarized. And increasingly, it will be war that uses artificial intelligence and replaces the human element. You know, the next generation of naval ships probably, or most likely, won't have crews. I think it's estimated that by 2040, fighter planes won't actually have fighter pilots in them. You know, they will be guided by artificial intelligence. And this is, I think, very worrying, not because only a few countries can afford it. I mean, I think the less countries that have such new weapons, the better in a way. But what's worrying is, when does the human element just get left out altogether? You know, if these are self-guided weapon systems, autonomous weapon systems, when does the human element come in, or is it just simply bypassed? And what if we get autonomous weapon systems that don't do what we thought they were going to do? I mean, we all know how computer programming can create glitches or produce effects that people didn't want. And, you know, it terrifies me. It's science fiction, but very becoming rapidly reality, that you'll get autonomous weapon systems that could easily run out of control of those who devised them.
On the subject of contemporary situations, I did want to ask you, and this will be my last question before we move into the Q&A. So you talk throughout the book a few ways that war gets used as a metaphor for other things, right? Or that you know, the art of war has become like the business person's Bible. You know, ways that ideas about the Blitz spirit have been deployed in the Brexit debate and so forth. Even books like The War on Cholesterol. And you spoke to this a little bit before about, you know, needing to be more specific about our definition of what we think is a war, and not maybe using the word so randomly. But I did wonder what you thought about some of the conversations this year that have compared COVID to a war, both in terms of, you know, how we're fighting it, but in kind of both practical and symbolic terms in many ways, right? How have some of those parallels struck you? Have we been fighting some kind of war on COVID? Or?
Well, I mean, I think in a war you have to have an enemy. And I have the same reservations as I do about fighting a war on terror. It's the definition of the enemy, and then the definition of when you've actually vanquished that enemy. And I don't think you can have a war on a virus. Right. But I think the COVID pandemic and our response to it has certain warlike features, which means that we have had to mobilize in ways we hadn't thought we'd mobilize. We'd had to draw on the resources and societies that we hadn't thought to do. We've had to give up perhaps some individual liberties, which we tend to do in war in the name of the greater good. So there are certainly features that resemble those of wars, but I wouldn't myself call it a war.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I've been thinking too about, you know, putting like the War Measures Act into effect to fight the virus and so forth. There are these parallels, and yet I agree with you. It's a disease. It's not an enemy army. So no. Thank you so much for answering all those questions in such interesting ways. I'm just now opening up the list here that Haley has been assembling. That makes sense. Okay, thank you. Yes. So the first question is from Meg Corner. Have you seen an evolution in the types of military violence and its causes in the post-Cold War world? How has war changed without the fear of another superpower?
That's interesting. I mean, funnily enough, earlier today, I was thinking about the impact of nuclear weapons on the Cold War. And once we got used, both sides got used to the idea of mutually assured destruction. In fact, they continued to fight. They fought proxy wars. They didn't fight directly with each other. I think they both recognized that that could be potentially very dangerous indeed and lead to an uncontrollable escalation. But I'm not sure I see that much shift in the ways in which wars are fought. A number of the weapons, of course, are carried over from the Cold War. We have, I think, less stability internationally with nuclear weapons. The old tension which held a sort of peace between the Soviet Union and the United States is still there, but we now have more players. We have a nuclear-armed China, nuclear-armed United States, nuclear-armed Russia. And I think that makes it, and of course other nuclear powers as well, and I think that makes it, the multilateralism makes it a little bit more unstable, which concerns me. But I think what is changing always is the technology and the increased use of computer-driven systems and the increased use of cyberspace are sort of newish battlefields. But I'm not sure, I'll have to think about it. It's a good question, but I'm not sure I see that much distinction between the sorts of wars that were fought before, say, 1989 and those that were fought afterwards.
So this is kind of a related question that might get you continuing to think about the one that we just heard, which is that this is from one of our graduate students, John DeLee. With the development of highly technical equipment to wage wars, the ability to wage them without fully integrating economies and industries of a nation, and with the rise of volunteer forces, have countries lost the need to have civilian support for waging a war? Are they less total now, I guess it would be the question.
I think it depends on the sort of war. I think you could say that what's happening or has happened in Syria was, for many people there, a total war because it drew in so much of society and no one really could escape, or very few people could escape its consequences. And I think if we were to get a major war, which of course I think we all sincerely hope we don't, between two major states, we might well find that either it's over very quickly or it settles into a long drawn out conflict, in which case society would be drawn in. I think it depends very much on the nature of the war itself. Short wars are unlikely to draw in the whole of society the longer the war. Even when societies aren't drawn in terms of resources, I think particularly, but not only, but particularly in democratic societies, if the public is not engaged in support of the war, then it's very hard for the government to go on fighting. I think that was one of the problems that the American military and the American government ran into in Vietnam, as the French did before them in their war in Indochina, that the public in the end simply didn't support it. And even in authoritarian states, I think, particularly an expensive and a war that goes on for any length of time has to have public support. I mean, one of the things that helped to undermine the Soviet Union was the war in Afghanistan, which became increasingly unpopular in the 1980s with the Soviet people.
Absolutely. And again, Haley's done a good job of organizing this because they're flowing very well. From another of our grad students, Michael DeFazio, he says, you mentioned how extraordinary press coverage of the Vietnam War, voluntarily granted by the US military itself, strongly facilitated the decrease in public support for the war. Given the negative military consequences of this press access, do you think military should be obligated to permit access?
Well, the journalists would think it, and the military, I think, would probably not. I've heard different opinions. After I said that about Vietnam, someone got in touch with me and said, "Oh, the U.S. military really were in control." My impression was not. That they decided to give the journalists access, and the journalists were able to hop on and off military helicopters, and I think had a fairly free hand in reporting. The British, when they did the Falklands War, kept a very tight press coverage because they were very conscious of not wanting too many sort of pesky reporters right on the ground. And so I think governments do try and control what's happening in war. Of course, it's probably more difficult for them today even than in the past. In the First World War, when little pocket cameras became very cheap, governments got very worried because people were taking snapshots. But now with phones, a lot of information gets out about wars. I mean, every soldier, every sailor, every Air Force person probably has a phone. And, we know how easy it is to take pictures, upload them, send them around. And so I think it is more difficult, although governments will certainly try to keep a lid on things, although they will do their best, of course, to try and prevent things that they don't want to come out. It's a very difficult question for the military because things happen in wars which are absolutely horrific. And do they want people to see it? And I think a lot of military would argue that any war has its horrors and has its death. I mean, that's what war is about. It is about violence, and that therefore, showing unmediated pictures of violence in war to civilians, they may not understand that this is just what war is like. It's always been a back and forth about how much you let people know about the war that's being fought.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking about cell phone cameras, but also it's like, imagine if they could have texted from the trenches, right? I mean,
Yeah.
in terms of censoring the mail and the efforts that that armies have made to limit communication from the front. So from another of our students, Lindsay Stoba, I really enjoyed your discussion of female warriors and soldiers in chapter 5. I'm wondering if you found any interesting differences and or similarities in the motivations between male and female fighters.
I haven't, and that's maybe just because I haven't found the right sources. When I read Svetlana Alexievich's book, this wonderful one about Soviet women in the Second World War, The Unwomanly Face of War, she did it. She did it building on interviews, and a lot of the young women who went off to war did it because of love of Mother Russia. They said, we felt we had to go, we wanted to do something, and I think that gave, she conveyed a picture of people who did it out of patriotism. And did it because they felt they had to. So I think we need more work on that, actually. Why do women go to war? I remember at one of my lectures that was in the north of England, and we had this really quite electrifying moment in the question period. And there were a number of army officers there from a nearby base, and this woman army officer said, I put my thoughts into a compartment. She said, I have 2 children, and I don't think about them when I go to war. I have a job to do. And it's exactly, I think, what a male soldier would probably say. She said, I just don't allow myself to think of my children. So I think it's actually, maybe it's a graduate student who'd like to work on this. I think it's a really interesting subject. Are the motivations different? Are they the same? And what exactly are the motivations?
Absolutely. I kept thinking about one of the women that I'm studying in my current work on the SOE, Odette Sansom, in an interview after the war with the Imperial War Museum, said, I was a woman with a strong sense of duty. She'd grown up in France and become a British citizen, and she also had 3 kids and left them in Britain and went off to occupied France. So I think it is probably very parallel in some cases, but I agree. We've got to look into that.
Yeah.
Another question from one of our Dale Center co-directors, our founding director, in fact, Dr. Andrew Wiest. Is the professed avoidance of civilian casualties perhaps an indicator of modernity in warfare? In many pre-modern wars in the world, it strikes me that civilians were often targets of war.
Yeah, I know it's certainly debatable. I mean, I think there were many efforts down through history to try and limit damage to civilians. You get it in a number of religions. The Catholic, well, the only church in Europe in the Middle Ages, tried to limit the sorts of people who could be attacked. Those who were merchants traveling shouldn't be attacked. Priests shouldn't be attacked. And they tried to say that Europeans should only fight on certain days, or they shouldn't fight on holy days such as Christmas or Easter. And so I think it actually goes back quite a long way. But I think what is different today is that we have really quite an elaborate system of law around this. And we have developed both international law, but also international conventions, understandings. And I think a number of armed forces in the world have internalized these so that it's not just a matter of the law that's out there somewhere. This is actually something about how you have to behave. And I think we've become collectively, and the military become, not in all countries at all times, but I think certainly in the present, we're more concerned to limit unnecessary damage to civilians, the so-called collateral damage. We do take very seriously wanton, as we see them, attacks on civilians. When the military by mistake bomb a school, I think there is generally horror at this, and even authoritarian governments, even ghastly dictatorships, actually try and cover this up. because I think they know they have breached an unacceptable, they've crossed a barrier in an unacceptable way. And so I think perhaps what is different about the present age is just the body of law, which is not just something the military feel they have to sort of notice. They've actually made it part of their practice. And I think, you know, a lot of military, including the US military, actually have very clear guidelines about what you can do and what you can't, and what are legitimate targets, and what proportional force you must use to achieve certain goals. You mustn't use disproportionate force if you want to deal with a small handful of people who have, you know, taken refuge in a barn. You don't destroy the whole village around it. I mean, I think we've certainly developed a regime. It's often breached, but I think it's important that it's there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you noted something I've thought a lot about myself, that, you know, it wasn't an accident that the Allies didn't include bombing on the list of crimes at the end of the war, right? Because then they would have had to evaluate their own strategic bombing campaign with a bit of a more clear lens. So
yes, yeah, yeah, and a number of Allied people in the Allied countries said what we're doing is a crime. You know, religious leaders, and Churchill himself once said, and the British carried out a lot of the mass area bombing, and Churchill himself said, you know, I sometimes wonder if we become beasts.
Well, yeah, I'm going to remember that one for class. Thank you. So this one is a little bit longer, from one of our graduate students, Cody Turnbaugh. Your book is largely about remembering and comprehending war. This is because while war is war is inherently connected to understanding humanity. While your targeted audience is those who have never participated in true warfare, such as we in the West who have grown accustomed to the long peace, I want to ask, how does this concept of remembering war change for the small minority who's experienced combat? Mainly, I'm referring to veterans coping with PTSD or related trauma. How does their mental struggle challenge or agree with our, or those of us who have never experienced combat's, ability to remember or understand war?
Well, yes, I think we probably aren't doing a good enough job as societies in helping those who have been in combat to readjust to civilian society and deal with some of what they've experienced there. I think the military themselves have become a lot more conscious of it. The military, I think, for obvious reasons, have always been interested in psychology. You know, and it used to be to make people fight better and make them braver or whatever. But I think increasingly they've become, quite rightly, concerned with the psychology of those who have fought in combat and how do we deal with it. We perhaps as societies don't take it as serious as we should, because I think now such a comparatively small number of people from our societies fight. You know, I think a lot of us could go through life without really meeting anyone who's been in combat or even been in the armed forces. You know, the armed forces are well, the United States armed forces are still pretty big, but they tend to be drawn from certain areas, certain segments of society. And I think even in the United States, where you still have a very big armed force, it is quite possible not to know anyone in the armed forces, but certainly in Canada and Britain, where the armed forces are smaller and smaller, you know, it is really something that is out of sight, out of mind. I think we don't pay enough attention, perhaps, as we should, to these issues. And I think we ought to be doing more about how we help people who have undertaken very difficult tasks on all our behalfs.
Absolutely, thank you. A question from another of our faculty fellows, Heather Starr. Thank you, Professor MacMillan, she says. You mentioned that one of the causes of war that we see throughout history is ideology. The US has gone to war ostensibly to, quote, make the world safe for democracy and to impose democracy. In the 21st century, do you think it's possible for the US or any other nation to successfully build a democratic nation after waging a war in a place?
I think it is possible to help to build democratic nations after a war, but you have to want to do it. You have to think about how to do it. And I think I would draw a real distinction between what happened in Japan and Germany after the Second World War, where there was, to begin with, an occupation, a very large occupation, in the case of Germany, 3 different countries. So tremendous resources were put into those countries, and there was a tremendous attempt made to overhaul the political systems, the value systems, the educational systems, to try and turn those countries into something that were more democratic and peaceable. And I think they built on trends that were already there in those countries. You know, not everyone in Germany had supported the Nazis, although certainly there was a lot of popular support, but there were those who represented a democratic liberal tradition, and the same thing in Japan. And there were traditions in both those countries which predated the 1920s and 1930s. So I think it is possible to help countries to move in a certain direction, but it's a tremendous amount of resources. And I think too often what we get is governments going in. I mean, the British went into Libya, for example, the coalition went into Libya to get rid of Gaddafi, but they didn't really think what next. And they didn't really put into resources into building a Libya that would actually function. And I would say the same thing went wrong in the invasion and occupation of Iraq. The British and Americans who were in charge of that decision didn't really spend much time on thinking, what do we do once Saddam Hussein has gone? And I talked to someone once who went to Downing Street and talked to Tony Blair, who's an expert in Iraq. And he went with a number of other experts. And he said he talked to Blair, who was the prime minister at the time, and said, it's not going to be easy to build democracy in Iraq because Saddam Hussein has basically, and the Ba'ath have basically destroyed the civic institutions of Iraqi society. It's going to take a lot of time. And he said, Blair didn't want to listen to them, wasn't interested. So I think it depends very much on what the government or those who win want to do. And too often, I think, we think that victory is military victory. We don't think about what happens after that.
Absolutely. Since you mentioned Japan in that answer, we have a question from Adrian Tan about whether economic inequality is an important reason for war to break out, or could it be today? Was this a reason which motivated the Imperial Japanese military in the early 20th century?
I think economic factors are important. Economic inequalities within societies don't necessarily lead to war, although they can contribute to revolution. But I think a society, a country which feels itself to be deprived or not sharing fully in world trade or world prosperity can see that as a reason to go to war. I mean, I think part of what drove Japanese imperial expansion and the supporters of Japanese imperial expansion was a sense that Japan didn't have its fair share of colonies, that it had joined the game of nations late, it had modernized itself very quickly and very successfully, but it didn't have colonies like the other great powers did. And until certainly the Second World War, the possession of an empire was seen as a mark, an indicator of national greatness and power. And I think what also drove the Japanese was a sense that their islands possessed very few natural resources, that they had a population which they could no longer feed, that they relied on selling abroad and they relied on importations from abroad to keep their economy going. And I think they felt that the only way to secure a prosperous Japanese and a safe Japanese was to expand. And so I think there were a number of things that drove Japanese imperial expansion, but I wouldn't say it was all economic. I mean, I think there's this very important ideological thing, this assumption of superiority. The Japanese had this image about China that we have been the younger brother of China for a long time, but by the 1900s, China was like the older brother who got into trouble. He was smoking too much opium, he was lying in the gutter, and Japan was the younger, vigorous brother who was going to take the older brother, shake him, turn him upside down, and run him for his own benefit. And so I think often motives for going to war can be mixed, but I think the ideological component is not just an excuse. I think it can be a very powerful motivating force.
So we actually have another question about economics of war from one of our grad students, Dan Ward. You discuss, Norman, is it Angle? The great illusion, the great illusion in war. Does economic interdependence really decrease the possibility of military arms in the present day? Or forces? I'm sorry, I think there's a word missing there, Dan. So yeah.
Well, I think I know what the question is about.
Okay.
Well, Norman Angell is this extraordinary figure who was British, but spent a lot of time knocking about the United States. I think he was a cowboy at one point. Anyway, he became a journalist and he wrote this book called The Great Illusion. And he said, it's a great illusion that a country will gain anything out of going to war. This was before the First World War. He said, these days, countries are so intertwined that if you go to war, you're basically just hurting yourself. And so if Germany wants to enjoy the benefits of Belgian factories, much better to let the Belgians keep on working and exporting to Belgium than try and take over Belgium, because the Belgians then will resent it. They won't work as well. I mean, I'm simplifying his argument, but he said, you don't gain out of war. He said, you might have done in the Middle Ages, but these days it's really stupid. And when we all depend on each other for trade, there's no point in going to war. And of course, the argument was very powerful, and his book was a wild bestseller, and you actually had courses on studying it and so on. And it didn't stop the European nations from going to war. Britain and Germany were each other's biggest trading partners, as far as I can remember, and yet they went to war. And sometimes actually closeness in trade, as we know, can lead to bad feeling. Under the previous administration in the United States, you got people, including the president himself, saying other countries are taking advantage of us. They're selling more to us than we're selling to them. And so trade doesn't always make people get on better. And the United States and China are now economically intertwined. That doesn't seem to me to have made the relationship much better recently.
So that's a good transition into a question we have from another of our students, James Barry, about, I guess, basically the likelihood of future wars. He says, do you believe that the Western world today has become too sensitive and adverse to warfare? Meaning, do you think that despite the power and prestige of European and American armies, could our aversion to war and violence make us vulnerable to more aggressive actors seeking to make political gains?
It's hard to tell, isn't it? A lot of young people in Britain in the 1930s said, we don't want another war, we won't fight for, there was this famous debate at the Oxford Union, we will not fight for king and country, which was a resolution which passed by a considerable majority in about 1936, I think. And yet when war came, a lot of those same people went off and volunteered. I think you don't know until it happens. I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States before 1941 who didn't want a war, didn't see any reason why the United States should get involved in a war ever again, were isolationist, and, very sensible of them indeed. But, when Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor, there weren't many isolationists left. I think, if I'm right, there was one person in Congress in the House of Representatives who voted against the declaration of war on Japan, a congresswoman from somewhere in the West. And basically, she's never been heard of again. Otherwise it was unanimous. I mean, someone will remember her name. So I think we can't always tell how we are going to react and whether we will respond to a threat until that threat actually occurs. I think we have to be prepared for the possibility that there may still be state-to-state wars. I don't think it's totally disappeared from the face of the earth. It's a shame because the weapons, of course, are more effective, more terrifying than ever. But the possibility is always there. If people are thinking in terms of being prepared for war, they at some point may feel they have to use those weapons.
Thank you. So sort of a related question in terms of how we view war and how we view soldiers. I have one more substantive question and then a quick question for you, and then we'll let you go. You've been answered a lot of them for about an hour now, but from one of our grad students, Maeve Lowson, in chapter 5 of the book, you mentioned there is a cultural need for heroes, and these heroes are often warriors. Do you think that collective and public memory, and perhaps even historians, too often mythologize war? And does this cultural, quote, need for heroes complicate the historical study of war?
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we do want heroes as societies, and when we find them in different places, we find them in sporting figures, we find them in people who do great things, we find them in people who are daredevils. But I think we have tended to mythologize our military heroes. A lot of the statues that go up are to people who did well in war, a lot of movies are made about them. But I think there's been a real shift in a lot of Western societies that those people who were heroic in war are no longer seen as admirable. That we are now looking for other sorts of heroes. And I think that, I think there's a cultural difference here. I think certainly in Britain, those on the right tend to admire heroic figures from the past like Wellington and Nelson. And I suspect it's probably the same in the United States. While those on the left say these are the wrong sorts of heroes and they were not so great anyway, and we should admire other sorts of people who did things for deprived social classes, or did things in medicine, or did things anti-slavery. And so I think who you admire in your past can depend very much on your political stance or where you find yourself on the political spectrum. And I think there's been, in many Western societies, really a swing away from admiring war, which is perhaps a good thing in itself. And so we no longer see in children's books or children's comics. I mean, when I was growing up, there were comic books about heroic fighters in the Second World War, and there was a very famous series, I think it was called The Black Hawks, who were pilots, who I think were in the Second World War. And then when the Korean War started, the comics sort of suddenly changed to the Second World War. And we sort of admired those people. But I don't think young children get those sort of heroes anymore. I think certainly in most Western societies, the military heroes are no longer as important as they used to be. And that may be a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the question reminds me of a few things that jumped out at me in your book, such as when you talk about, the changing view of certain quote unquote war heroes, that Field Marshal Haig's public perception in the 1920s was very different than potentially it is now, or the way that military leaders inspired each other, that Napoleon was obsessed with Alexander the Great and things like that. So
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue. Thank you. Last question. This is a very easy one. It comes from one of our supporters, Dr. Beverly Dale. She says, "Thank you, Professor MacMillan," and she wants to know if your Reith lectures from 2018 are available anywhere online still. Does the BBC have them on the radio?
I think the BBC might have them. I think if you go to Reith Lectures, I think they have their own website, and they might have them. Or they may be on YouTube. I mean, the terrifying thing about YouTube is nothing ever disappears.
Haley has just Googled it. Apparently they are available. So
okay. Yeah, no, I think the BBC, but there's a problem. I think you can't always get the BBC in the US, can you? I think it depends. But maybe Haley is the tech whiz. So if she says they're available, I believe her.
Yes, it looks like we've put the link in the chat already. So
well, amazing. Yes, I'm so impressed.
So thank you, Haley. But I just thought that was a good question to end on, because I think it speaks to how much everybody has enjoyed listening to you today and reading your book and want to hear more. So, so just thank you so much for sharing this work with us and taking time out of your day to answer so many questions.
Well, thank you all so much. And as I say, it would have been much nicer to be there with you and meet face to face, but we do what we have to. And thanks for all the good questions, yours, but also all the good questions from the audience. There were a couple I'm going to have to think about, and so I'm going to go off and do that.
Well, that is definitely always the sign of good question, right? To keep thinking. So thank you. And yeah, we hope to have you here in person one day.
I'll keep my fingers crossed. Okay. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye. Thank you to everyone else for coming out.
Yeah.